All right. I'm one of the NMSs you've heard about, a neuromuscular specialist. I'm a pediatric neurologist at Duke, and besides the regular clinical care that I help provide, we're also involved in clinical trials. And I've learned a lot over the past 5 or 6 years as I've gotten involved in more and more trials. And as you'll hear in just a second, and as many of you are already aware, the number of trials out there has expanded tremendously just over the past 5 years. And so that brings up a lot of difficult questions and decisions that need to be made on the part of parents. And my goal with this next hour is to raise some of those issues, some of those things that maybe families haven't thought about when they're thinking about a trial, and hopefully generate some discussion if we can get through on time for questions and discussion. And I need to be done by 6 because then Abby is on. So without any further ado, we're going to start with our panel here. And we've got 5 members on the panel. They're all going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes on their particular topic, and a very diverse panel. Anne's a genetics counselor. Erica Goody is a clinical research manager at UC Davis. Tina, who you heard from earlier, is physical therapist. Amber Sapp is a mother of a child with Duchenne and also a physical therapist. And Tara Moorhead's director of clinical research at Pfizer. So we have a broad a group of people with broad exposure to the different aspects of clinical trials. And again, I hope this will generate some discussion. I hope, my understanding is that there are quite a few newly diagnosed families here this year as well. And hopefully this will help you if you're interested in clinical trials, as you begin to start thinking about participation in one of those. So let's start with Anne. And that's your first line.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, I'm sure you've seen this slide already today and are probably going to see it many times over the next few days. So this is the pipeline graphic for all of the trials in Duchenne or soon to be in Duchenne, and it is really quite remarkable. I remember years ago at this conference, there were maybe only 3 or 5 bars, and now we can barely fit it on one slide. So it's really amazing and very exciting, but at the same time, we know it's completely overwhelming for families to look at this and try to figure out which trial might be the best for their child. And it's not even necessarily like there is one best trial, but just trying to weigh the pros and cons of each trial and figure out what might be the best fit for your family. So my role in this panel is I really just wanted to highlight some of the resources that we at PPMD have on our website to kind of help you through this process of learning about clinical trials and exploring the different trials that are out there and help you with that decision process. So I'm just going to show you some screenshots from our homepage or from our webpage. And again, this is the new PPMD website, which launched last month. So if you haven't been there, I really encourage you to check it out. To find all of the clinical trial information is actually quite easy now. So you're going to go to the main PPMD website, and if you click on the research option, you'll see under that a drop down that has all of the clinical trial sections. So I'm just going to review each of those quickly. The understanding trials, considering a clinical trial, exploring clinical trials, and then the trial finder tool. So under the understanding clinical trials section, we actually do have some text that you can read that's about the different phases of trials, and there's a lot of good information in there, but we know that nobody really likes to read anymore. So we have a new clinical trial video library that we've made. And this is actually a really great group of about 15 videos. And they're all videos of individuals with Duchenne or Becker, their parents, and leading clinicians and researchers in the field. So it's really a great set of videos. Each video is probably only between 2 to 3 to 4 minutes long. But they're very well done, and each video covers a different topic. So there's a topic on the benefits of trial participation, the risks. There's one on logistics and how to deal with that with everyone else in your family. There's an entire video just on the placebo arm and why those are necessary. So there's a lot of great topics within this clinical trial video library. The next section is considering a clinical trial. Within this section, the main part of this, actually the only part of this section, is actually a clinical trial decision aid guide. And this is a guide that was made with researchers at RTI International. So a group of social scientists helped us to make this decision guide, which is basically a worksheet that you can download on your computer and work through. And the whole purpose is to help you weigh the pros and cons of trial participation and help you figure out if trial participation is even right for your child and your family in general. So this is a really helpful tool. The next section is exploring clinical trials. We have always had a trial finder tool. It was actually housed on the registry site, but now it's part of the main PPMD site here, and it's set up a little bit differently. It's this table, which this isn't the best screenshot, but basically all of the trials are now within this one table, and you can sort the columns based on age or ambulation status, steroid use. So it's a really great way to quickly see which trials might fit your child based on your child's age and whether or not they're on steroids, or if you're looking for a mutation-specific trial. And you can even sort by industry, like if you would only want to see the Sarepta trials or whatnot. So it's really a nice tool, and there's different tabs across the top for actively recruiting. This slide is a couple weeks old. We've since changed it, but you'll see actively recruiting, not yet recruiting, the ongoing trials, meaning they're fully recruited but still ongoing. And we even have a tab for preclinical trials and for female carriers. And then the last slide I wanted to show you, and the last kind of feature in our clinical trial menu, is the Trial Finder tool, which you may, those of you who are familiar with our registry may have used this Trial Finder tool that was on our registry site. It's actually called the Antidote tool. It is now embedded within your registry account. So to get to this tool, you need to log in to your registry account, and you'll see that on the dashboard. There's a box on the right that says clinical trials, and you click on that, and it actually automatically pulls some of your information from your registry account. So it looks at age and diagnosis and gender and where you're located, and it pulls directly from clinicaltrials.gov to give you a list of trials that your child may be eligible for. This isn't perfect yet. We're really hoping to be able to soon pull more specifics from the registry account, like your child's ambulation status and steroid use, but still it's a great tool that you can use within the registry account. So those are just kind of a quick overview of all the clinical trial resources that we do have on the PPMD site. I really encourage you to check it out. Since we did a major overhaul of the site, a lot of things have been rewritten and are more concise. The videos are really great to watch, and there's a lot here for you. So, and if you have any trouble finding anything, I'm at the registry table most of the conference, so I'm happy to show you where things are if you need help. All right, next person. If that's going to advance. Oh, there we go.
So stop pushing the button. Sounds familiar. Yeah. Okay, Erica.
All right. So my name is Erica Goody. I'm the research manager at UC Davis. We have a really long name, so I dare all of you to say it 5 times fast. It's UC Davis Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the Neuromuscular Research Center is our full title. We just say PM&R. So one, I just want to thank you guys for letting me be here and talk about it. But I also want to thank kind of Dr. Craig McDonald because he supports my crazy antics. And every year we have a Halloween party. And I have themes. And also Dr. Henriksen always dresses up with us. So this year our theme is Star Wars. And we shut down the lab. And every kid with Duchenne or any neuromuscular disease comes over and we have a big Halloween party because what do scientists do? We celebrate Halloween. So what I need to talk about is kind of what to do, because right now Duchenne muscular dystrophy is so exciting. There's so much research that wasn't here before, and to families that can be kind of overwhelming, because now what's kind of happening is you guys have choices. Before it was 1 study, 2 studies, and it was a gene specific and things like that, but now you have a lot. So kind of with that comes responsibility from the families. So kind of what you guys need to look at is, I think of the basic things: the who, what, when, and why. So who's the pharmaceutical company? Who's the PI? What is the study? What's the phase, the drug, the mechanism, kind of the breakdowns of that? When does it start? How long is it? Is there an extension phase? All of those kind of questions that you guys want to know. How many times is the treatment going to be? These are all specifics that are different for each protocol. We have 30 studies that go on at UC Davis, so that's a lot of navigating, kind of having families figure out what would be the best fit for them. And then also, why is this study being conducted? What's the mechanism of why we're actually doing the science behind it? And that's really important for families to start understanding, because you're your best advocate, and so we can help direct you, but you really should have kind of those basic questions. So the first tool that I love, because, you know, researchers love their little tools, is clinicaltrials.gov. PPMD, as you heard, also has their setup, but clinicaltrials.gov, I just did this search, and this is where I kind of want to show to families that it can be a little intimidating, is that I just put in Duchenne, and there's 228 active studies listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So how would you as a parent navigate that? So I feel like the best part is to look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria to your child. Some of the basic things to really kind of rule out some studies is, first, the age of your child, because that will be a really close indicator. Then you guys need to look at the ability and strength, and I'm so glad that Tina's on the panel with me, because that is a huge component of inclusion-exclusion criteria of where your child would fit. And then kind of the current medications. This is really important right now, because there's been a lot of talks by different panel members about medications. So right now, with a lot of the clinical trials, you really, as parents, need to understand the inclusion-exclusion criteria of what drug or supplement could exclude you from a trial, because that's happening right now. And it's okay to go, you know, and have a supplement or change your prednisone or things like that, but you need to know that usually to go on a clinical trial, it could be 3 to 6 months before you can actually be enrolled. And right now, studies are enrolling fast. So as a parent, you kind of need to talk to your care physician about if you're thinking about a study and then changing a medication or adding a supplement. I'm not saying no, you just need to make sure if it would take you out of the running to be part of a clinical trial. So also the biggest part is see if it's manageable for your family. I'm not gonna lie, these clinical trials can be up to 8 to 12 hour screening visits, 2 days, people are flying in. So you guys really need to just think, can we do this? Is this logistically possible? Can he do certain procedures that are part of the study? So look at the study procedures. Can your son do an MRI? Can he do pulmonary function tests? Because these are all inclusionary or exclusionary criteria, so it's really important to kind of look at the study design to see if this is something that would be possible. And then how does he tolerate certain treatments? Can he do a weekly infusion? Can he do an injection? Can he swallow a pill or a powder or drink a certain amount of calcium with his medication? These are all really important because, as I said, screening is a real big 2-day process. So if you get past that and then it's the actual baseline visit and you're about to take medication and your son freaks out every time that there's an injection, is that a good fit? And you guys would know that most because you're the parents, so you know your child. So this is my tips for you guys. Ask for a copy of the consent form prior to coming. So if you're in touch with the coordinator or anybody like that, ask for the copy of the consent form because the consent form will break down everything for you. Next, talk to the clinical evaluator. What we do a lot is if there's functional testing that your child might be marginal and you're curious about, we actually schedule phone calls with our clinical evaluators to kind of talk to the parents so you're not traveling from Alaska to California to find out, oh, he can't do that. And these are just basic questions that they just kind of ask you, because we'll always screen, but you know, people have lives in school and stuff like that, so you want to determine, is it actually something that could be for you? And ask questions. I tell everybody, ask as many questions as you can. So now I'm going to talk about consent and assent, because for research studies, this is really, really important. So the consent form, why I say to get a copy is the consent forms now are on average 20 pages long. So if you imagine that you're like, oh, I'm going to be in this study, and you get this consent form, and you're sitting down for an hour with this bearing thing, you need to make sure to like have it beforehand so you can ask your questions, have them pre-written, so that we can answer those questions for you, because it's a lot. I've had up to, I think the most I had consenting with me is 25 people came, and that was really intimidating. I think that was more intimidating than this right now. So the other tip is bring snacks and entertainment, because for these young boys and anybody, consenting can be as long as you guys want it to be, really. I planned for an hour, but I've had it go for more. You need some sort of entertainment for your children and some food and stuff like that, because it's really hard and you're going to be asking tough questions, so make sure that they're comfortable. Number one important thing too is the consent and assent is always ongoing. So just because you're signing that consent form the day of screening, you need to know that whenever there's new findings and things like that, that you guys can always come to us and ask questions. Write them down, talk to people, because that's something that I think people forget, is that this is an ongoing process. Results get published and things like that, so you'll want to know there's a new study. What if you want to switch? That's the time that you guys should know that you can always come and ask. You can ask the PI, the coordinator, and the clinical evaluator. You can ask any study team person, but also know your guys' questions are hard. So sometimes we have to go back and research ourselves the answer. So give a little bit of patience, because you guys ask the tough questions where we might have to go to the sponsor to ask clarification, or I might have to go to the physician and ask questions. So just know that, we might have to do some research too. All right, this is the tough one, sharing data or results. So it's really important, everybody, that we keep research confidential. Very important. We share what we can share. Sponsors are very good at our pharmaceutical companies letting us know what we can or can't share. You need to know that like study data labs, vitals, they're continuously reviewed by the physicians to make sure that your child's safe. I always say in our lab, safety is our number one priority. So we always are making sure that your child's safe, and we'll let you know if we need to have some sort of vitals or EKG or something like that. But you also know that study efficacy data, the strength and functional part, can only be analyzed also at specific times. And many times we can't release that. Many times the coordinators can't even look at that, or the clinical evaluators aren't supposed to look at that. And so why, everybody wants to know, because there's all these studies, why can't we know? Why can't we be there when our child's testing? What's with all these rules and these secrets? Well, it's not secrets. Really, what we want is we want validity and efficacy for these endpoints. We want, when we have this, if we have everybody sharing data and results, then it's not what FDA wants. It's going to hurt your FDA approval. So we need to make sure we keep the study valid. And last, I have to say a big thank you. I have to first thank my family because my husband's a firefighter, and as everybody knows, California likes to burn. And a thank you to my in-laws and my parents, because nothing like getting your trip here and then finding out that he has to be on call and having them all figure out childcare. So big thank you to my family because it's a team. And then a thank you to my UC Davis team, and then lastly to all of you guys here, all the families and people working to research. We like to say at UC Davis, our slogan is discoveries create hope. This is the most hopeful it's been. It's so exciting, it's so cutting edge, and I'm happy to be here and part of the team, so thanks for having me. Thanks.
Kathy, when did we start? Did we start late? Okay, good, all right. Press it once and wait. Well, Tina's next, right?
Okay.
Bye. There we go.
That's my disclosures. Great. So now I get a chance to take off my clinical hat that I spoke with some of you about this morning and put on my research hat and kind of give you an idea. My task is to give everyone. Oh, whoops, sorry. Better? Okay, thanks. To give you an example of outcomes. So why do we choose the outcomes we choose? What's the secrecy behind seeing your PT and kicking the parents out of the room? What's really happening in that hour and a half that we have your kids? And then give you an idea of what these outcomes really kind of look like. And so in the next 5-10 minutes or so, that's what I'm going to focus on. So what are clinical outcomes? So clinical outcomes are the measurements that your child's performing in the research study that helps determine if a treatment's effective or not. And so there is some type of method to the madness in choosing outcomes. And so there's usually a room full of people arguing back and forth what should be used, what the inclusion is, what the exclusion is. Sometimes it has to do with these outcomes that your children are performing, and sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of it also has to do with the FDA. The reason why I'm pulling this up is because of the FDA clinical outcome assessments, 3 of them are observation-based. And so I know there's a lot of development and concern, and as a parent, you're asking, why can't I submit a video? Because I see my child doing this. Why can't I show you that? It's because it's a research trial, and so we're trying to standardize things as much as possible, because in a animal lab, we could, it's a very structured environment. Children aren't mice, and so we have to control the environment as much as possible, because these tasks that children are asked to do in the clinical trials are performance-based. And so it's really hard and it's effort-dependent, and so we're trying to structure it as much as possible to decrease the variability, because more variability leads to longer timelines for trials, more financial risks for the drug companies, and so what we're trying to do is control the environment as much as possible. So what the FDA calls this are performance-based measures, and this is what your child's doing for an hour and a half when they see their clinical evaluator. So when companies are choosing the outcomes, what is it based on? A lot of it has to do with what the drug is supposed to do. So if it's supposed to increase muscle force, there may be more muscle force or strength-related assessments to ensure that that's really being assessed. And then the endpoints. Why are the endpoints used? And a lot of it has to do with what we know about the endpoints. When it comes to drug development, endpoints itself takes a lot of time to really make psychometrically sound endpoints. So they have to be reliable, they have to be valid, you have to make sure what you're testing is really what you're trying to measure. So that takes time. So a lot of the endpoints end up being endpoints that have been used more frequently and have been validated. And then the other question is for the inclusion. Why is it that my child has to complete the 4-stair climb in 8 seconds or less? Well, that also has to do with a lot of natural history data that I talked to some of you this morning about the prediction of a loss of a function. So if a study is supposed to last a year and the primary endpoint is a walking endpoint, if the child that's part of the study loses the ability to walk, that child has lost. they've lost the endpoint that's being used for the primary assessment of the clinical trial. And so that's why there's those kinds of inclusion criteria to best guess the amount of patients that will remain in the study at the end of the study. And then so here is just a schematic. There's a schematic of drug development. There's also a ton of outcome measures that are out there that you've seen multiple times that's used in the natural history of Duchenne. And so these outcome measures are also what we use to decide what outcomes should be used in trials. And it's based on a few things. It's based on how old the child is, because some tests are validated in young kids and some tests are not. And so depending on the age, the mechanism of action of the drug, and what the test actually does. And so I won't go through all of these, but some general tests that you will see in clinical trials are strength assessments. And so those of you who were here earlier in the day, you notice that a lot of these are similar to the clinical assessments I pointed out. There's strength tests and some of the manual muscle tests that are out there, as well as quantitative muscle tests. It just gives an idea how much force your child's able to produce. And Dr. Smith asked me to give kind of a general time frame for some of these things. It really depends on how long or how many muscles are being tested to see how long this assessment actually takes. And then there's a lot of functional tests. And so again, these functional tests, the first one's pulmonary function test. And so in order to make the test effective, they have to also be at an age where a child can do it. And so part of the screening process is your child able to perform some of these tests? And so a lot of these tests, they really have to have a decent attention span, be able to follow directions, and be able to follow 1 to 2 tasks directions. And so in general, there's the 6-minute walk test is as you'll see. The North Star is a compilation of 17 items that looks at standing, sitting, jumping, walking, and running. The stair climb, which is 4 standard stairs that's typically used in the research trials that have a set height as well as width of the stairs, so that's standardized. And then the performance of upper limb, which is used to measure upper limb strength with the ability to bring your hand to your mouth, a hand over your head, and reach for tasks. And
Is an assessment tool.
Instead of me charading all of these things through, I thought a quick few-second video will give you an idea of really what these assessments look like, and so that you can understand why we're doing what your children are doing when they're in the assessment room. And also, going back to videos, some of the question comes around with videos too. Part of the standardization process for clinical trials is to look at quality control. And so a lot of times your videos are videoed so that the physical therapist can assess and see if the administration of the test was done properly. It is entirely private and it's not used for any other purpose besides for quality control and or training for the trial itself. So real quick, here is a snippet of some of the functional tests that your children will be doing, and I would like to thank the Federation to Eradicate Duchenne because they were big contributors in making these videos happen.
Is an assessment tool developed specifically to measure upper limb function in Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
That's the upper limb test. It's supposed to mimic
This is a
functional
function-based
activities
evaluation
of daily
designed by
life.
expert physical therapists who understand DMD,
Great
using
job.
valuable
Keep
patient
going.
input to
Looking
focus
at
on
reachable
movements that are
workspace, how high you
required to
can
perform
stack
daily
things.
activities important to
Opening up
individuals
potato
living
chip
with
cans,
DMD.
or not cans, bags. Writing.
With PULL, we now have a validated patient-focused tool
Hand
that
dexterity
assesses
task.
function throughout the entire spectrum
Phone,
of the disease.
Mimicking things.
Is an assessment tool
North
specifically
Star
designed to
assessment.
measure functional tasks for individuals with Duchenne muscular
Standing
dystrophy
tasks, looking
who
at
are
their balance.
ambulatory. This assessment
Gross
measures
motor
17
mobility, like
items
bed
related to
mobility.
activities of daily living, including sit to stand, walking, hopping, and jumping. Items are graded on a scale designed by expert physical therapists who understand motor strength changes in individuals with DMD. The NSAA is a validated assessment tool that quantifies function throughout the ambulatory stages of the disease as a measure for clinical trials and to document.
Steady, go. And here's the 6-minute walk test.
Good start.
The video makes all these
Remember
look
walking
really
as
easy,
fast as you
but,
can, but no running. Good boy.
So they would do this for 6 minutes, walking around the cone.
Well done. Round the cone. Good boy.
And then the
Very
evaluator
good.
also has to block off any kind of
Keep going as
traffic
fast
from
as you
the
can
hospital
and go tight around
staff.
that cone at the
So,
end.
Set, go.
And here's
Go, go,
a
go,
set
go,
of
faster,
stairs
kid,
is
keep
what it
going,
typically
keep going.
looks
Good
like
job,
and is what
kid.
we ask the
Stop
boys
and
to
stop.
do. And that is actually really hard. They never stay pointing
Stop at the
forward.
bottom.
They always turn
Well
around or do
done.
something
Good
funny.
job.
I have about 30 cuts of the stairs. And so this is just an example. So the hour and a half that we have your kids hour to hour and a half, depending, but that's usually how long it takes. What's accounted for part of that time is also rest, but a lot of it is coaching, coercion, anything that it takes to get the best reliable data. So it does take a village. This is not the clinical village, but it takes the research village. And we appreciate your time. And I know these are really, really difficult tests for your kids to do. And so hopefully this will give you an idea of what happens in the secret hour and a half while you're kicked out of the room.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, the videos made that look really easy. So Amber's next to talk about burdens of trial.
Hi guys, thanks for sticking with us this late in the day. I'm starting to glaze over a little bit myself. Okay, so I have, as you may have heard earlier, I am a physical therapist. I also have a son who's almost 12 with Duchenne, and clinical trials are we're no stranger to them in our family. And I've debated whether or not to share this little story from a couple of years ago, but today has felt very clinical to me, and I kind of want to make sure that we remember there is a human perspective to this. So I'm just going to read this. This is a sort of a Facebook essay that I put together after a particularly tough day at clinical trial, in the trial he's still currently involved in. Broad shoulders. Kids are not little adults. They sometimes don't act the way we want or need them to. They sometimes get overwhelmed and refuse to try. For most kids, you move on and you chalk it up to being tired or contrary. But for our kids in clinical trials, it's a different story. Trying to explain to Garrett that his indifferent attitude during the 6-minute walk test or his sheer refusal to attempt to rise from the floor not only affects him, but so many other boys, is a hard sell. His desire to save himself the shame of failure at these tests translates to poor study results and thus a tougher approval process for potentially beneficial drugs. I get this. We trial parents get this. But am I putting too much weight on his then 9-year-old shoulders? To bear the weight of clinical trials and the toll it takes on them emotionally, not to mention physically, and then remind him it's not just about him. In an effort to save our sons and a whole community's sons, are we asking too much of these precious boys to dig so deeply as to put their own feelings aside and do this for the greater good? But we do, and we return every 4 weeks to do it again for a long time, for Garrett, for a whole community, for the greater good. So as a clinician, I understand informed consent, all that goes along with that. But as a parent, I feel like it's also important to understand that there's maybe a more honest approach that I want to share with you guys. Do you agree to collect a stool sample from your child and carry it in a Ziploc bag in your purse every month? Do you agree to work all day, drive to the clinic site through the night, arrive promptly at the hospital at 8 a.m. in a time zone an hour earlier than your own? We've messed up on that a few times. Do you agree to make your child do schoolwork while in the hospital with 2 IVs hanging from his arms so he doesn't get behind in school while you try and not feel guilty about it? Do you agree to float $300 to $500 up front each visit to pay for travel and meals while awaiting the reimbursement check from the sponsor? Do you agree to entertain your child and his siblings in a 9x9 hospital room for 6 hours each visit with reruns of the Disney Channel while continuously reminding them to sanitize their hands? Do you agree to sleep in a lumpy hotel bed under a questionably clean comforter every month while the toilet continuously runs through the night and random strangers run through the halls? If so, you may be ready to start a clinical trial. So on a serious note, there are definitely some burdens that go along with clinical trials, as many of you understand. And so first I want to talk about the psychosocial burden. We have hope, obviously. That would be the real hope, that we hope that our child is not getting placebo, that he's doing better. But then there's a little bit of misguided hope when we put too much emphasis on the outcome of a trial. There's the emotional strain that our child undergoes, as evidenced earlier. There's this pressure to perform well on these tests every time, this physical discomfort, maybe if it's an IV or an injection, and then the associated anxiety every time he has to go through this. If they have siblings, the siblings are at risk for less support from parents, as well as taking on more adult roles at home. I think this is also the case with Duchenne in general, but specifically more during clinical trials. The strain on a parent, there's evidence that there's an increased risk of anxiety and depression in chronic disease, and this is even more pronounced when you have clinical trial you're dealing with. Then there's a strain on marriage and family life. It's just hard. It's hard enough with Duchenne, but then you add this other layer of clinical trial, and it's more accentuated. Should I still be waiting? Okay, then we have a financial burden. So some sponsors will require families to pay up front for things like food, the gas for your vehicle or your flight, and a hotel. And that can be very prohibitive for a lot of families. There's been many times that we'll wait 2, 3, 4 weeks to get reimbursed for things. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Some of the expenses are not covered. Some trials we've been a part of will cover meals for my daughter and my husband. Others ask us every time to put a little red line through whatever she ate for breakfast that day. But those are also costs to consider. There are hidden expenses as well. I'm going to call these the fun factor. Things like movies when you go, so it's not just all about the trial, or zoo trips, or what we like to do personally is guilt Legos. We buy a lot of those. And then there's lost wages. There's a lot of time that you're off work, and if your job is not flexible, or you can't work remotely, or something of that nature, then that's a huge issue. And then there's a logistical burden. Thankfully, my husband has a job that's flexible, and he's able to go with us. My job is flexible. Not many are not, though, and so that's definitely prohibitive. Schools that allow flexibility, whether it's worked into your IEP, we've chosen to homeschool. I know a lot of you families do that as well for various reasons. It works well for clinical trials for us. Then there's this issue of coordinating travel and lodging, and many families are required to book lodging themselves, book their flights, and that's just one more layer of logistics that you sort of have to deal with. Some sponsors will use a third-party travel company. You give them your recommendations or your what you would prefer, and then they can make arrangements. But again, it's another layer. And then as our boys progress with their disease and their equipment needs get more, the travel just becomes difficult. Whether you're flying or driving, you carry a lot of baggage, quite literally. And there's a time commitment. So, for example, the trial we're currently in, we go once a month, and we have been for more than 2 years now. He's in an open label portion, which can extend another 4 years. So, we sort of hear that this trial can last 24 months, but we don't often take into account that there's additional time maybe at the end of that. If you're going to stay in for an open label extension, or if you're considering another trial following the current trial you're in, there may be a 6-month washout period. So just factoring in all of those things. And I like to think of myself as a glass half full kind of girl, so I can't leave you guys without mentioning some of the benefits of clinical trials. So there are definitely potential therapeutic benefits, which is why we all get into trials to begin with. That's our hope. Then there's also close monitoring by the research team and doctors, which you may not even consider. But if, little things pop up and you're automatically going to see a specialist every time you go. There's potential extended access for new drugs during the open label. And then the altruistic benefit, which we mentioned earlier, this concept of doing something for the greater good. And I think that our boys are so good at this, and I think for a lot of them it comes naturally, but I think that's a characteristic that is very valuable that they learn through trials. And building family relationships. The current trial we're in, like I said, takes us away from our home once a month, and it really forces us to spend time together as a family. So trials have allowed us to go to great dinners and enjoy the zoo or the museum together in an effort to make more good memories than bad. And so I want to leave you guys with this quote. Sometimes in life, we become so focused on the finish line that we fail to find joy in the journey. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber. So now that nobody wants to have anything to do with clinical trials, Tara Moorhead from Pfizer is going to give the industry perspective. So give it a second.
Oh. So yes, I'm thinking maybe if we're ever asked, I know I'm a late addition to this panel, but maybe we should get like a dunk tank or something, and they could just, and I don't even have to speak, and you could just hit it as many times as you want. But I'm here, and I want to thank all the panelists for being here, but especially to Amber. Thank you for your candor. It's really good for us to hear, and there's a lot of room for improvement, and I don't want to dismiss any of that. I'm just here to offer a little bit of perspective on what goes into the clinical trial development on our end. And I'm a director of clinical research, as Dr. Smith mentioned. I work specifically and exclusively on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Okay, and just a quick disclaimer, employee of Pfizer, any forward-looking statements I make about any of our current studies, hopefully you don't hold me to them. So I'll breeze through this because I know we have time, we want time for questions, but just typical drug development, so as you understand, so we call it drugs, and maybe that has a negative connotation, but this is because we hesitate to call anything that hasn't been studied in humans before that's well understood medicines, because we don't want to be misleading. So we refer to them as drugs, and oftentimes in terms of clinical development, we have 4 phases that we have to go through that can take an average of about 10 to 12 years if we're lucky, and not to mention like $2.6 billion, I think it's the average, but we get to this point where we're going to test for the first time, oftentimes in healthy volunteers. But it's after decades or people have spent their entire careers trying to having an idea and developing these ideas and testing them in animals and even getting us to this very point. But as you'll see, each process, each phase we have to go through, and oftentimes even after we test in patients and we see that it may be working and it indeed is safe, we then have these large trials that cost maybe hundreds of thousands of patients. We have placebo arms, which isn't always well received, which we totally understand, but it just helps in terms of understanding that what we see is real, but it's just a lot. And if we're lucky to get to the point of completing our phase 3 and still seeing positive results in our data, we get to file for regulatory approval, and then we have some usually long-term or post-authorization studies that we have to do. But in Duchenne, and in rare diseases like Duchenne, and this is thanks to the incredible advocacy organizations and families who have lobbied for more flexibility, because time is not on our side, and we don't have thousands of patients that we can study these therapies in. So for one, typical phase 3 studies end up going away, are certainly large studies. And then sometimes even as we move into gene therapy or gene transfer, we might even get rid of the healthy volunteer studies, because if they have the gene, introducing another gene just can complicate things. So what does that leave us with? Sometimes just one big, massive, demanding trial. And as researchers, our job, our number one job, is to get you the clearest answers in terms of whether this drug is safe, whether it has some therapeutic benefit, as quickly as possible. And so when we end up trying to go faster, and we end up with this one trial that we're trying to get all the answers that we would have figured out along the way, but we're unable to do, we get afraid to cut corners. Because the worst thing, I think the biggest disservice that we can do to the community is to end up with data that we can't interpret. And so we want to get the clearest answer, and but we don't want to wonder, what if we had just thought about this and included this, and what if we had more patients? And so we try to get everything that we can without compromising the fact, or coming to the point where we don't know what we're looking at. And that's all the sacrifices that you've made be for naught. So sometimes that results in an increased burden on the families, and we apologize for that, but that's kind of what we're struggling with. So whom do the drug developers and the protocol authors, the ones that design the trials, need to consider? Of course, it's the patients and families. And if we had our druthers, we would only think about the patients and families, and we wouldn't, whatever you felt comfortable or whatever was okay for you, we do, and we wouldn't do anything else. But unfortunately, we have other people to whom we're responsible, and other organizations to whom we're responsible. And one of them are the regulators, the FDA, for example, who are in place, who are to make sure that what we see is real, and that we're doing things in an ethical way. And so that can kind of infringe upon or impact how we design our trials to make sure that we're sticking to the strict criteria that they lay out for us. And then if we're lucky enough to get over that hurdle of getting regulatory approval, we also have the payers, who are almost as popular as big pharma representatives. My husband actually works for health insurance, so we're really popular at dinner parties. We have neighbors that don't even want to talk to us. But I can only imagine how many hours the parents in this room have spent on the phone with health insurance companies, and that's horrible and unfortunate. So we also feel an obligation as the researchers and as the developers to make sure that we're not just convincing the regulators, but we're also convincing them, because as I mentioned, $2.6 million, or even for Duchenne, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that go into clinical research. Even if we have a shortened timeline, that we have to make sure the data is robust enough that they're willing to cover it, because it's another huge disservice if we get to the point of approval, but then nobody can afford it. And then just two other things that kind of not get in the way, but just also that we have to consider is the competitive landscape. As Anne nicely showed, there are now 30 plus trials right now, and probably more coming, and 26 research sponsors and institutions who are doing research, and just to be considerate of the landscape and make sure we know that what our competition is. Competition is awesome, it's a good motivator, but just to keep that awareness. And then the investors, and of course there are a million other things, and of course patients are patients, and that's what's important, and the money is money, and we don't really want to pay too much attention to that really, but they are funding us, and we have to make sure that, again, our data, that what we produce is something that's helpful to the community and informative, and hopefully continues to advance the science. And just thinking of it as, for every dollar that they're spending on our Duchenne research, they might be, they're maybe depriving, or there's other diseases that aren't getting that funding. So what can we do, at least on the developer side, to try to bring the patients and the families back to the top with all these other considerations and these other factors? One thing, Amber, you did an excellent job. Again, thank you for your candor in terms of the fatigue, the guilt, the impact of clinical trials on participating families. That can be frustrating, second guessing, even isolation sometimes, either frustration for not getting the results and you're in this trial for so long, and even you may have completed the trial, but you're still waiting because the study's not over and we haven't unblinded yet, and that can be painful. And even the isolation of not wanting to compromise any results, and here you are then feeling like you can't talk to anybody as you're struggling through some of the challenges. One thing that I think a lot of us are doing, and it's with the help of the advocacy organizations and the patients and the families, and it's thanks to them, is their willingness to meet with us as we develop and design our trials and go over some of the really things that families might be more sensitive to. And be considerate. And of course, we still have a lot to learn, and there's a lot of opportunity for growth, but not only will we try to meet with them to show our study design, but we'll also try to take advantage of meeting with them again, thanks to Catherine Beaverson, and say, hey, did we hear you? Did we get it right? And do we need to message this differently or design it differently? And then just in terms of the impact that families have on clinical trials, without you, we have nothing. We won't be able to advance the science. We won't be able to achieve that goal of transformational therapies. And we're so grateful and we're so humble. The disease, we get to understand the disease and its burdens. And that's actually not only in terms of the disease as it progresses, but also what's meaningful to you, what matters to you. And that's really helpful for us as we continue to progress in our development. And obviously, we understand about these drugs better in terms of whether they're safe or efficacious. We've done a lot of research in animals, but when it might manifest completely differently. So we're so grateful for that. This is just, Erica already touched on it briefly, but just in terms of some of the risks with sharing the data and why we don't want you to come across as secretive or feel as though you can't speak to something that might be really awesome that you're experiencing. But just some of the things that we wrestle with being on the research side and the skepticism we have when we hear about maybe a patient who's really doing well is we get excited internally and we don't want to take away from that, but we also struggle with, I think it's our job to be skeptical, otherwise we're not going to be able to deliver a really robust output. And so sometimes there's a creation of maybe false hopes and expectation. It doesn't mean that what you're experiencing isn't real. It just might be that it's early or we don't quite understand it, and we're just hesitant to really hang our hats on it. Similarly, there might be some confusion then by families who then are really attracted to hearing some great results from another family and they decide to participate in one trial versus another, and maybe they don't see the same thing. So then they're disappointed, and it could just be because the results might differ between patients, or they might be inconsistent, or again, we're still learning. Sometimes there's disappointment about families, as you mentioned, the altruism. I've never met a more altruistic group of people in a community, but sometimes there are families who are really excited for what another family is experiencing, but at the same point, there's a little bit of maybe mom guilt that exists, or dad guilt, that they're not in the trial, or they're not able to participate for whatever the reason. And then just an influence on the broader community. That's just something that, of course, again, we get excited whenever we hear that there might be something that's positive, especially if families are happy as opposed to feeling the burden. That's awesome. But sometimes we might inadvertently get so excited that whether we mean to or not, it influences our design, and it influences how we might progress the program. And so those are just some of the challenges with which we're faced. And again, not to take away from anyone's experience. Hearing about good experiences is actually really awesome. But so what's required to be successful in clinical research? Obviously, the patients, the families, number one. And then thanks, Amber, and to your family. And then we have the clinicians, the treating physicians, investigators, Dr. Smith, thank you, coordinators, Erica, and physiotherapists, Tina, and then, of course, Anne is representing the advocacy groups. We wouldn't be able to do this. I think it's great that we all work together. We also just have us, again, the dunk tank might be a good idea. We still have a lot of room for improvement, as I mentioned, in terms of really understanding the burdens and making sure that we're accommodating and that we are considerate in our designs. I think as as we evolve in this space of drug development, I think even the needs and the burdens and the hopes and the wishes will evolve too, and so we need to continue to make sure that we're on top of it. But we're here. We all have the same goal of finding transformational therapies for the boys with Duchenne, for your boys, and we won't stop working, but we need to rely on each other. And so just want to say thank you to all the families and advocacy organizations, investigative sites, and the researchers. I'm humbled to be here, and I'm totally inspired. So thanks.
Thanks, Tara. So I'm going to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. If we're all here for another couple days, so if you'd rather talk offline or ask us questions, I know we're all here and more than willing to try to answer your questions. But if you do have any questions, feel free to come up and ask at the mic.
I don't so much have a question as a comment. So I'm Annie Kennedy. I'm with PPMD, for those you haven't met or I haven't met yet. And I just want to thank you. This was an amazing panel to all of you. And I think what this reflects is that as we have more answers, the questions are getting harder. And I was struck by a few years ago we wouldn't have had any logos here. We wouldn't have had any bars on the pipeline slide. And so we really are very blessed in our community now to have so many companies in our space and so many trials now. And that doesn't make it easier as families to have to navigate what to do, how to blend the trial options with the care options, which is why we're going through all this as a community. But I do think as we're doing this, we're so grateful to the sponsors to be in this with us. And some of the themes that we've heard on this panel are things that our sponsors are working very hard with us on. So one of the things I think it's important for everyone to know is that PPMD does convene what's called the Duchenne Drug Development Roundtable, and it's a consortia of all of our industry partners who work together on pre-competitive challenges and opportunities, and what are the things that we can work to do to solve together. And there were a series of meetings over the last few years where we really delved into some of the things that came up here today. And Kathy convened a meeting around trial burdens, and we looked at what we had learned in the last few years with the regulatory interactions we'd had at the FDA. And out of that came an effort to look at harmonization across clinical trials. And there were guidances, lowercase g, not uppercase g, that FDA puts out, that were developed by a work group comprised of representatives from industry, from clinical trialists, from academics, that are now getting ready to be published. And so our goal is that we're streamlining what happens across clinical trials and that you won't find as many differences. And Amber, you did a beautiful job articulating some companies do this, some companies do that, that there might be a roadmap, if you will, for companies and for families, and that there won't be as big a gap for families when you're trying to navigate which way to turn, but also for companies to know what the preferences are for the community. What are the best practices when conducting trials in Duchenne? So that's one of the things that we've tried to push out, and we've really leaned in with companies together to work to do that. So that's coming, and we're working to get that pushed out and published, and some of the companies are starting to already implement that into their protocols now. So we thought it was important for you to know about that.
Yeah, thanks. Great, thank you.